The invasion began just the way everybody figured it would happen. Just as soon as the forces reconsolidated and figured out a battle plan where they couldn't just bombard the holy crap out of the planet, they came. The opposition force was there on the other side of the planet from the human ships. The so-called Purification Fleet launched its landing craft. Thousands of small craft headed towards the surface, flanked by thousands more of aerospace fighters. Though bumpy, they figured it was going to be a simple drop. Nope. Humanity, at least what was there, had a better idea for them. Just as they broke into the atmosphere, ordnance of every size and shape, anything that was pushed by some sort of chemical concoction was being thrown at them en masse. The dropships tried to use their point defense systems, but there was just too many. Then the atmospheric fighters came roaring in from unknown areas. They had no idea where in the hell these came from. They didn't see them from space. Yet they began launching from platforms that seemed to be hidden. It's though they were birthed from the planet themselves as they came out one right after another. But that wasn't the scary part. It was the drones. The drones were coming out of the ground in holes just big enough for themselves, and they were coming out like wasps after you piss on their nest. The aerospace fighters immediately broke off to engage, yet because they're aerospace fighters and must be able to handle in and out of an atmosphere, their mobility is limited, to say the least, along with the limited countermeasures they had. With the amount of items that were being flown up into the sky, some which was shot down before it even made there, but those that crashed into the fighters, the aerospace assets, the shuttles, anything, all of it came crashing to the ground in what is known now as the metal rain. Burning hulks crashed in with such fury that anyone still on board would completely be atomized. The drones were just so much faster than they could hit. Reason being is they didn't have any meat bags on board and they could move like a damn missile. They also were able to carry far more ordnance. Though they carried smaller ordnance, it was amazing to see the amount of precision-guided munitions fly away from them in huge volleys. The only issue was if you got into a firefight, their movements were predictable to anyone who was observant. They were also quite frail, as they were quite literally just computers with engines and couplers for ordnance and one main weapon. The aerospace fighters also lacked all sorts of maneuverability, again because they were laden down with so much extra equipment. This made them unable to dogfight once their missiles were expended. In fact, they had the maneuverability of a Su-25, which can be outmaneuvered by a simple A-10. It was embarrassing. This created a downpour of metal rain as they were unable to retreat. They were shot down the moment they even tried to turn and run, which gave all the ordnance a chance to lock on as they had to fire their thrusters as hard as possible to try and break the gravity of the planet. The transports themselves fared far better. Reason being is the pilots were very smart. They stayed in formation, and this saved many of them. They covered each other as they descended, using their point defense systems, missiles, and any type of assets they had to stop the incoming ordnance, though many were still hit and forced to crash land, if not just simply explode and tumble to the ground in another drop of metal rain. The forced inside were, well, forced to jump out. Those inside used jump packs to try and get free. Any avian species that could get out was able to open their wings and fly away, and any other species that had the chance to actually have jump packs on used them. However, it was noted that at least 11% of those that had to jump were lost. This was a statistic that even the humans understood was a hard one to crack. On the way down, they either fell victim to ground fire or they simply ran out of their rocket fuel propellant and down they went, screeching the entire way, a final scream of defiance as gravity had taken control, and physics is not their friend. On final approach, the transports had another problem: ground-based cannons. They raised up from their hidden locations just as those missile launchers had come from hidden locations, and they raised themselves up as fast as possible, firing accurate, armor-piercing, high-explosive shells into the sides of them, causing many of them to lurch sideways, upside down, and many of them spinning and falling down, crashing hard into the ground, killing many of those inside, and those that were still alive just did not want to move. Many of them were forced to do hard landings through enemy fire, and even more were not able to actually get up as their engines had taken damage they needed to repair them before they could go. And even higher losses continued from the purification forces. The transportations that landed immediately started to unload. In fact, many of them were smart and had opened up their gates before they even made it to the ground. Infantry and heavy weapons poured out as fast as possible as they were attacked the entire time by artillery and the occasional airstrike. Immediately, they started heading to the closest town or city and their objective. On the way, they were ambushed constantly. Behind every ambush would be artillery. It seemed as though the shots themselves were warnings, as though they didn't understand. How could somebody who was shooting call for fire on them? Wait, is there more than one? I thought snipers only worked as one. The humans do it different? They didn't know. Anti-air kept most of the human air fighters out of the airspace. From constantly strafing, this was going to be a problem. They wanted to know if there was going to be a strafing run because they heard the sound, the human sound. If you heard it, you check to see if you're already dead. But chances are, someone else was not. The few times the ambushers were seen, the snipers were seen, they would simply fade off into the foliage. They would seemingly shoot and just move. And the snipers, of course, would aim for anyone who was giving orders. If you waved your hands in the air and it wasn't something just to get someone's attention, bang, thud. In fact, you wouldn't even hear it as your brain matter was sprayed across the nearest vehicle. They would only fire once. Even if they knew they hadn't been seen, they didn't want to fire a second time, or they would be seen. Those that were running up to try and catch them would launch a whole bunch of high explosives in that area and then run up, trying to find what was left of those that had just fired at them. But there was just nothing ever there. No rifle, no blood, no smell of anyone getting hurt. Where the hell are they? Frickin' ghosts? This drove more of the morale down more and more and more. The prepared positions were a patchwork of absolute hell. This particular challenge was that way because it was camouflaged. All of it was camouflage. It seemed as though these bunkers would simply raise up out of the ground from nowhere and then fire before they could be fired upon. They would then, once fired upon, drop, and then it was almost impossible to get through. This would seal them from any direct fire, and the opposing force would have a whole bunch of trouble trying to crack them open to make sure they didn't simply pop up again and start firing. As losses began to mount up for the opposing forces, all they could do was call in for air support or artillery to take out these positions once spotted. Yet sometimes the air support couldn't see it. The orbital strikes could, but they couldn't use orbital strikes. They knew that that was a bad idea. This was something they would hold unless they absolutely had to. Yet still, it was difficult to strike them, and eventually they had loaded up some sort of new bunker buster bomb that these new Xenos had decided to build. Though difficult to strike, well, it worked. If they didn't have that, then they would have to barrage the area with artillery, sometimes stopping the entire column from the time of the first launch from 3 to 30 minutes to make sure that the position was taken out. This slowed them down even more, giving more chance for the defenders to take potshots at them. By the time they reached their objective, forces were absolutely exhausted. They were low on ammo, low on morale, but they still charged in. Entering the capital city, they felt their adrenaline pump in. They knew that these extra shots were going to come in handy for something as they didn't produce adrenaline naturally. They rushed in, started kicking in doors, running through buildings, but it was empty. Though a few automated defenses, there was nothing there. They started asking, where is everybody? Did they actually evacuate the planet? Is everything just an automated system? The soldiers didn't really care. It was the first rest they had got, and they were going to take advantage of it. As they sat down, put their weapons off to the side, and believed that they had taken the objective so they could rest. At least, that's what they thought. As they set up a perimeter around their new prize, so to speak, they believed that there was no way that the humans could get in as all their weapons were facing out. That was their mistake. At that point, the city decided to come to life. From every building, every street, every hole in the ground, human shapes emerged. It was impossible at that point to tell robot from biological as they all ran bipedally. And armored humans, or whatever they're everywhere! Some of these human shapes carried large munitions, rockets, missiles, large caliber ballistics strapped to them. Others only carried handheld weapons and seemed to lunge at the opponents. They carried weapons like laser sharpened long blades, heavy axes that seemed to break through the armor of anyone they hit and go right through a torso, to even a strange looking sword that had a motor on it, of all things. And as they squeezed the trigger on it, it seemed to come alive, and as it struck onto whatever it was going against, it seemed to slowly chew through the armor. Those inside did not scream in pain at first. They screamed from terror as they knew once the armor was breached, the teeth on this, what did they call it again? Chainsaw was going to slowly tear through them, ripping flesh, blood, and bone and spraying it everywhere. Those that were able to fly tried to use this ability to their advantage. However, they were shot down quickly as they were an easy target. There was no way to get enough altitude to get out of the way. The chaos took over, and one human screamed, "Their defenses are broken! Let the slaughter begin!" Hours before, Larry had left Aya to take full control of his ship, and he headed down to the planet's surface with the chief and as many of his robotic companions as possible. He couldn't take them all. He had to leave a skeleton crew to aid with repairs, but he took as many as he possibly could. As he landed on the space pad, something happened when he got there. He was lowered into a massive underground hangar, and immediately his shuttle was pushed off into an area so that the hangar could be brought up again, and the pad could bring another shuttle down. They were well hidden inside of the planet itself, and as he looked around, others were already consolidating their forces. They needed to find out what the hell was going on. With a quick inquiry, he found out that the opposing forces were already heading into the town center. Remembering the battle plan, he took his forces to the location for the counterattack. As he moved on, he saw his son with a new wife. He didn't have time to talk, he just had to move at that point. He wanted nothing more than to make sure that everybody was okay, but he just didn't have the chance. Reaching the rallying point, he got ready for the next phase. He began to check the enemy progress on his devices. The automated turret defenses were doing a bang-up job pretty much, with 61% remain across planet, along with planet-wide artillery holding at 83%. Missile batteries down to 71%, with only 58% ammo remaining, unfortunately. The issue is the attack is only on half of the planet. They still hold the other half with their, well, if you want to call it fleet. It's a good thing they're bluffing their way through because they just do not have the ordnance anymore to take down an entire push from the enemy. Because it's only on half the planet, the 61% of the turret defenses planet-wide was only 11% that were fighting on the side that was being assaulted. Now that the invaders have breached the cities and town centers, it's time to move on to the next phase. Around the planet, everyone waited for the green light, literally, checking and double checking gear as they wait, and they wouldn't have to wait for very long. As the lights turned green, all comms went dark. The jammers went into active status, which means all radios are out. Not even direct communications are going to work, except for maybe a couple short range if you're lucky. Also, with this, the ship's sensors would malfunction. They wouldn't be able to get a good look at the surface, and they'd have to constantly be trying to cut through the static. But the jammers were constantly changing the way they were operating, which meant they would only get a few glances at best. This also meant no heavy artillery on either side could be used, as the ones on the radio wouldn't be able to call in and let them know where to fire. This also limited air support at best, which meant they're down to simple dogfighting at visual range. Thankfully, they had already set up to make sure that each of the squadrons knew exactly where they were going to have to patrol. In this moment of confusion, human shapes burst onto the scene. The invaders tried to call for backup, but nothing worked. Their armor began to panic as they had no idea what the hell was going on. Every time they opened up their hatch to try and ask what was going on, somebody was shot. This meant the gunner would end up swinging wildly and firing at anything that seemed to move, friend or foe alike. Eventually, they tried to leave, but they would find themselves on the wrong end of a rocket, a mine, or anything that's going to blow them into tiny little pieces. In the small towns all over the planet, invaders panicked before getting torn apart. In the few cities on this colony world, chaos reigned everywhere as no one knew where in the hell the humans were coming from, what type of ordnance they had. All they knew is they were now desperate. They were freaking out, and those who are desperate are dangerous to not only the enemy but to themselves. Commanders try to tighten their perimeter to try and keep the humans out, only to find that the perimeter has already been breached and there's enemy inside the wire. This caused even more chaos, and eventually the commanders said, "Fuck this." The first 3 waves of the invaders had already reached the ground, and they were in complete disarray. As the 4th wave approached the cities with fresh armor and weapons and fresh soldiers among everything else, they see the first 3 waves running towards them. What the hell? Why are they running towards us? They find out really quick. They're not running towards the 4th wave. No, they're running away from whatever's trying to kill them. Before the fresh convoy can even figure out what the hell is going on, explosions begin landing. Very little warning, as it seems like something is cutting through the air, and they barely hear it before kablooey. Not only is high explosives landing, which don't do much to enemy armor, but there's also something else blowing up. Something that leaves a white mist in the air, at least for a moment, and then everything erupts in fire. The vehicles that are touched by this burst into flames, and everyone begins to lose track of what the hell is going on, as there's no comms to tell them what to do. Many of them take the initiative and fire back when they can, trying to keep those on the other side back as much as possible, but they are not sure what to do. Eventually, their commanders make their decision. It's a long, long march back to the pickup zone, the PZ. All the while, humans are relentlessly pursuing them. The invaders, every once in a while, will fire randomly back. Even though these are blind shots, they hope this will make the humans break contact and leave them alone. Many of the invaders have left their weapons and gear behind as there's no room for them on the vehicles or in them. Just they need to lighten the load. They need to get back as soon as they can. They wonder how the humans can have so much stamina to chase them all the way. The invaders are mainly leaving on the vehicles or in them, and yet the humans seem to be walking and running behind them and keeping up with them. Every single time they stop to try and charge a vehicle, repair something, do anything, it seems like they only have a few minutes, maybe an hour if they're lucky, before the humans catch up and begin to fire at them again, send more ordnance their way. How can they do this? Boy, they're persistent. As they reach the PZ, the landing craft begin to come down. That is when more air support comes in force to make many of them crash into the ground. They do not fire on those that are able to take off, and everyone sees this as they rush to get inside any type of transport. Those on the way down, though, are fair game, which makes many of those on the ground very scared as they see several of these ships come down in flames and burst themselves on the planet's surface, many of them lucky enough to belly land and just lay there like a burning phoenix that has been shot in the ass. The purification fleet was able to get small glances of what was happening to the retreating forces. Thankfully, they were able to cut through some of the jamming due to the fact that several of their own ships are now on the ground. Those that made it there with comms that actually operate, they're able to get pieces, little pieces. They're trying to figure out what the hell is going on. They could see that the humans were closing in. A giant cul-de-sac was forming around the PZ. It seemed as though they were tightening a noose around their people. They had to do something. In desperation, the decision was made to fire at the attacking humans just to hold them back. Just give us some time to get our people out. On the surface, no one saw it coming. It was a very short barrage. Only about 20 of these orbital kinetic strikes came down in front of the human lines, right between them and the retreating forces. They had to be very careful as they had many forces on the ground along with many transports, and they wanted to get them out of there. The humans near the PZ were simply sent up in the air from these strikes, sent tumbling all over the place, many of them missing a part or two. A few of those that were close enough to the strikes were flying out, and in one case, a head came flying and landed, yet what was coming from the head was sparks. It was one of Vince's boys. Well, he looked over at them as he collected his thoughts and thought, big mistake. In space, within moments of those strikes landing, hundreds of ships burst out of the void, each of them with a massive burst of power so large no one's going to miss it. The smallest were about half the size of Larry's ship, and then they got bigger and bigger and much bigger. The Purification Fleet watched as massive warships arrived and just covered in weapons and armor, so much so that you would think it's some sort of animal that's covered in spikes, yet each one of those spikes was a cannon that was ready to bring all sorts of death. The largest one showed up and was almost 25 times the size of Larry's ship, and it started deploying other warships from its ventral side, and this absolutely petrified everyone. Immediately, the Purification Fleet knew what they saw. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing. A voice came across their comms. This is Fleet Admiral Menendez de Avalez of Earth's 14th Fleet. You have just fired into sovereign human territory. Power down all weapons and engines and surrender. If you do not comply, we will be forced to open fire on you. Nothing happens for a moment as they are all in shock. It seems as though the Admiral was taking a couple breaths. Then he said again, I say again, power down, or we will be forced to engage. You have 30 seconds to comply. Any idiot could see that they were beyond outgunned at this point. By space standards, they were at point blank range, which means you couldn't dodge any of those shots if it's fired at you. You might be able to stop it from coring you and making it end up glancing off the side, but the amount of cannons meant that first volley was going to be absolutely devastating. As they looked off, they could see that this was the first human fleet that they had ever seen. The first war fleet. Wait a minute. First war fleet. Isn't this their entire fleet? Wait. They thought to themselves. Didn't he say they were the 14th fleet? Does that mean there's at least 13 more? With this information and realization, the enemy ships began to power down immediately, and with this, the jammers on the surface were deactivated. The Admiral sent another message. Send your leaders to the coordinates sent to you. We need to speak.